1832 and 1854 took quite a toll on Hamilton, Ontario. Cholera spread through the 19th century town, bringing death and a backlash against immigrants and the poor. Anne Herring is a professor of anthropology at McMaster University who studies infectious disease and epidemics. She joins us now to explain what happened and how it changed a growing city. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you, Nan.
I'm thrilled that you're here. Fascinating reading. But I want to begin by giving our viewers some context. Your students wrote a book called Hamilton's Forgotten Epidemics some years ago. Why look at Hamilton in particular?
Well, there are lots of reasons to look at Hamilton. First of all, the students at McMaster are in Hamilton, and it's important for us to know something about the community that hosts us. One of the things that we try to do in anthropology is to translate our learning back to the community. And so one of the purposes of looking at Hamilton closely was to give something back to the people of Hamilton.
And how important is this principle of giving something back to the community in the field of anthropology?
Well, it's actually central to it because, for generations, anthropologists have worked in communities and in partnership with people in communities. And certainly in the early years, were quite rightly criticized for taking information away, publishing it in a foreign country, advancing their careers, and the people who they worked with didn't benefit from it. And there has been a sea change in the way we look at those things. It's happened decades ago. And it's always important to work in collaboration with and partnership with communities and make sure that any information that we have gets back to the communities. And so that really is an important piece of the ethics of doing anthropology. And so these little books that we've been working on are a way of actually doing that.
And you're here to talk about Hamilton's not one, but two cholera epidemics. I had no idea. I mean, I've heard about it because I'm from Africa. So in Africa, I've heard about the cholera outbreaks in Europe, but I had no idea it happened in Hamilton. Just to remind our viewers, how prevalent was cholera in the 19th century?
Well, actually, the disease of cholera was a new disease in many parts of the Western world in the 19th century. Up until about 1817, it had been pretty much, we think, endemic in the Ganges region of India. And then through the British Empire and the expansion of trade, the bringing of soldiers and so on, cholera began to move out of what was thought to be its endemic home in the Ganges area into other parts of the world. So in 1817, there was a huge outbreak in an area just near Calcutta in India, and it gradually spread from that center through to the east and through to the west, so that it eventually arrived in Western Europe. And it was from there that it got transferred to North America.
And what does cholera do to the body?
It's a pretty nasty disease. It's something that's very treatable today, but in the 19th century, there was basically nothing anybody could do about it. What it is, it's a bacterial disease. So the bacteria itself is shaped like a little comma, so it's sometimes called the comma bacteria. And what it does is it's an infection of your intestines. And it's not the bacteria itself that does nasty things to you, it's the fact that the bacteria secretes a poisonous substance, a toxin.
In your body?
In your body, in your intestines. And what it does is it prompts all the cells in the intestines to just lose all the water. So the big symptom of cholera is massive diarrhea and vomiting. And it's not unusual for people who have very severe cases to basically dehydrate within the space of about 24 hours. So it's a horrible way to experience a disease and to die because you basically vomit.
You just drain.
You just drain, yeah.
So once you get it, is there a cure?
Well, now there is. It's a matter of replenishing the fluids because the cells in the intestine sort of regenerate every 24 hours. So if you can keep the body rehydrated and if you can keep it from going into shock, which is what happens, basically, when you lose all your fluids, you go into shock and the organs start shutting down and so on. If you can keep the body hydrated, you have a very good chance of surviving.
Oh, what a way to go.
Yes,
oh my goodness.
nasty.
We have a picture here of German painter Alfred Rettel's engraving titled Death as a cutthroat.
Yes.
What role did imagery of cholera do in terms of shaping people's fear of the disease?
Well, it not only shaped it, but it reflected what people thought about the disease. Can I talk a little bit
Of course.
about this
Yes,
image?
please.
What it tells you is in the middle is this skeletal figure of death. And death is playing a so-called violin, but it's actually bones. So central to the idea of cholera was that it was going to kill you. And as a new disease, people were terrified. And it was shocking to see people who had previously been healthy dying around you. Another interesting thing about this depiction of cholera is if you look at the upper right-hand corner, there's a kind of vague figure. And what it is that is the representation of cholera itself. And cholera was depicted as a disease that came from other places. So that added to the fear because it was not a disease that people were familiar with. It was a disease that came from somewhere else. And the figure is depicted as sort of an elite Egyptian. So it was, configured as a disease of Asia or Eastern Asia. So it, unlike the other figures in the image, this is sort of very vague and kind of lurking in the background, compared to the image of death, which is very clearly shown. And then you also see in the left-hand corner, the musicians who are fleeing in fear from the masked ball that they were playing at. And one of the names for cholera at the time, it had many names. It had the Blue Death, it had the Hot Plague, it had many names, was the Strangling Death. And you can see how there is the fear of people dying literally in the midst of a ball, probably people who are well-to-do. So cholera touched everyone. It didn't just touch the poor, even though the poor were disproportionately affected by it. And if you look at the faces of the musicians as they flee, you can see the fear and the horror and the worry very deeply etched in their faces, which really contrasts with the kind of blank image of the cholera individual itself. So these kinds of images really would have the effect of depicting what people thought about the disease. It was a disease from somewhere else. It killed you. And at the same time, it also represented what people thought about it.
I want to talk to you about the first epidemic that hit Hamilton in 1832.
Yes.
Can you paint us a picture of what Hamilton was like then?
Yes, very different from what it's like today. It was a small village. It was a village of less than 1,000 people. It didn't even have village status. It was like a small hamlet. Mm-hmm. It would have been a place that was surrounded with farms, and in fact, there were lots of animals that were in the streets. People had privies, outdoor privies. The water was gained from wells. And of course, the big problem with cholera is when you get contaminated water that has been contaminated with the cholera bacteria, which often happens when people lose all their fluids. It gets into their clothing, it affects the people around them, it gets into the groundwater and so on. When you can't separate the waste material from the water that people are drinking, then cholera has the chance to take hold, and that's exactly what happened in Hamilton, because there was no sewer system or way of separating human waste from well water. There were 4 wells that people basically drew their water from. So once those wells became contaminated, then you had every chance of getting cholera.
So the fertile ground was already set. Was
Yes.
the city prepared at all to help curb the spread of it?
It was prepared in some ways because, of course, what was happening in Europe with the epidemics was getting transferred to the people in the Americas because they were hearing about what was being done. And in fact, all kinds of measures were put into place, none of which had much effect, before cholera landed. So cholera landed in Hamilton in July 12th of 1832. It had already landed in Montreal and was working its way up through the inland waterways. Mm-hmm. And people knew what was happening in Europe and what was being done. So there were attempts to put quarantines in place. There were attempts to try to clean up the environment. because even though people didn't know what caused cholera at the time, they did have a sense that it was related to filthy environments.
And besides the filthy environments, was there any other ways that people thought that it was caused?
Well, some of them thought that it was caused by person-to-person contact, but really the predominant way of thinking about disease at that time was that diseases came from filthy, smelly areas, and they let off this horrible smells. You breathed in the smells and you became sick. So in that image we looked at earlier, one of the musicians who's fleeing has a handkerchief over his mouth, and that sort of, I think, suggests that he was trying to prevent getting the cholera because of the idea that you breathed in the nasty fumes.
And how would you characterize how people treated people that they thought had cholera?
Well, they were terrified. I mean, literally whole families died within a single day. So one of the things that people did was that they fled. That isn't the kind of reaction that makes you want to take care of your neighbors necessarily.
One of the essays that I read was the story about a young boy fleeing into the countryside
Yes.
To be with his uncle, and then he ended up having cholera, and
Yes.
his uncle actually ran him back into town on horseback, like
Yes.
telling him to get away. So
Yes.
family turned against family, friends turned against friends.
Yes,
Every person
absolutely.
for themselves.
Yes, yes, because they didn't know what was causing it. And you can imagine what that was like. You know, you see people who perhaps the day before were healthy, doing what they would normally do, and then suddenly they're dead. And all that people could think was that I'm next, and we don't know what's causing it.
So how was the epidemic eventually controlled?
Well, to some extent, it petered itself out. If we look at 1832, I mean, cholera in this part of the world was a summer experience because it was related to the high temperatures, which would, you know, allow contaminated waters to persist. Once the fall rolled around and winter, cholera generally disappeared.
And what was the death toll?
Well, we don't have a very good idea, especially about 1832, because there were no records really in place. And normally for a period of time like this, we would look at church records and the like to get a sense of how many people were dying. Well, some church records from that period have survived for us to look at, but many people weren't being buried in the way that they normally would. This was one of the things that was put into place to try to prevent the disease from spreading. So normally if somebody died at this period of time, they might be buried at home. There were churchyards that were available. And if they had a church ceremony, then there would be a record. But there were regulations put into place that were asking people to bury the dead very quickly and not to go through the traditional period of mourning, to have a wake, to have large numbers of people at a graveside.
How did people react to that?
Well, it was awful, because what it meant was not only did you lose the person that you loved, but you couldn't grieve for them in the proper way. And for many people, it meant that they weren't given the proper burial that would allow them to proceed to the afterlife. So it was, you know, all epidemics of this kind completely upend societies. And a lot of the traditional ways of rituals can't be maintained. And so they're always transformative. Epidemics always change the way people behave.
So that was the first epidemic.
Yes.
Can you tell me about the second one, which took place in 1854?
Yes. Well, of course, you basically have a generation that has grown up knowing about cholera by the time the next epidemic came around. And so people were better prepared for it. It was not a new disease anymore. It was
So it wasn't
something
as
that
deadly as before?
It apparently not, but we don't really have good numbers from either period of time. But from the best that we can figure, it was a lot less virulent. That said, you still had, in some cases, you know, 7 people dying a day. In other cases, even more than that. And that is a kind of a terrible thing. We think that maybe 17 or 18% of the population died in 1832, probably a real underestimate. As best as we can tell, it might have been maybe 4, maybe 5% later on.
This time around, did immigrants and the poor face a similar backlash?
Yes, yes.
How?
Well, one of the things that happened in 1832, of course, was the cholera epidemics coincided with a period of massive immigration to Canada. And something like 50,000 people came into Canada, which was a relatively sparsely populated place, in that 1 year of 1832. And they absolutely were bringing with them the diseases that they had perhaps contracted before they came or en route. But you have to know what the conditions of immigration were like. These ships were crammed to the hilt. There was no sanitation whatsoever. And so you stood a very good chance of dying on way or once you got here.
So you're saying that immigrants were to be blamed for the epidemics? Or
They were blamed.
They were blamed.
They were blamed.
Should they have been blamed?
There's always blame in epidemics. Mm-hmm. What is interesting about it, though, is that local people at the same time, there were all kinds of things happening in terms of mostly religious disputes, and the Irish in particular were subject to all kinds of discrimination because of the British Empire and the way in which Canada was positioned in the British Empire. So the Irish came in for especially harsh blame for the epidemic. The epidemics came with immigrants, there's no doubt about it. At the same time, the global epidemic that happened at that period of time was a product of British imperial activities in India. And so it depends on how you want to think about it. And certainly blame is typically a feature of any epidemic, but it doesn't help.
You know what's interesting is that they were all on the same ship, but the people who were, I guess, in the upper decks, the rich people, were not blamed the same way as the poor people. They probably had this disease as well, right?
Yes.
You know, they're in the same environment.
And when they arrived, they were able to go somewhere, whereas the immigrants who had no connections were stuck at the sheds in the worst possible sanitary conditions you could imagine. And so it pretty much predisposed them to getting cholera if they didn't already have it.
Let's talk about some of the steps the authorities took to stop the spread of cholera. What infrastructure was created to deal with the spread of the disease?
Well, it was pretty pathetic, even though they did try to put it into place. I mean, in 1832, there was no real sanitary structure that existed. So there were attempts to create boards of health, which were sort of run at the local level. The idea being that the boards of health would examine households, tell people that they needed to clean things up, try to make the environment not conducive to cholera. But by and large, they were ineffective because they certainly didn't have enough money. They didn't have much power. People resented, certainly in 1832, they had no power to enforce a family to do something about their circumstances. And people couldn't. You know, these were not people who had all kinds of resources at their disposal to completely gut their houses and get rid of their clothing and their goods and so on so that they could be sanitized. So when you ask people to do something like that, it's a choiceless choice. They don't have the choice to do it. They
imposed fines for people who wouldn't comply, right?
They tried to impose fines, and it was more common in the subsequent epidemic, absolutely, in 1854. In 1832, it was rather disorganized.
How did these new measures affect the citizens' day-to-day lives?
Well, in terms of their daily lives, probably not a whole lot. What people feared was the visit from the Board of Health inspectors and then what that would entail. In terms of their daily lives, a lot of people would, I suppose, just try to stay away from cholera-infected areas.
And now how do Hamiltonians now acknowledge the epidemics of the 19th century?
Well, most of them don't know about it. And that's one of the reasons why we thought it would be fun to do this book. And in fact, people are shocked when they say, "You mean we had cholera here in Hamilton?" And it says, "Oh yes." And it was in Toronto, and it was in Montreal, and it was in Quebec City. It was all over the place.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
That was such a thrill to read and find out all this information.
And that's why we call it the Forgotten Epidemics, because I think people's sensitivity to cholera was sort of stimulated in 2010 with the outbreaks in Haiti, the terrible cholera outbreaks there. And so they became more aware of it as a disease as a result of that. And then to think that it happened in Hamilton, probably not too differently.
Mm-hmm. There's a huge disconnect because I think sometimes people are like, oh, it happens over there, but it wouldn't happen here. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And we have a photo here of the Gore Park fountain.
Yes.
What's the story behind its creation?
Well, the Gore Park fountain is a real central place where Hamiltonians meet just to kind of hang out, have a coffee, whatever. It's in downtown Hamilton. But it was built for the first time. It's been rebuilt a number of times. It was built to celebrate when Hamilton had its first pump house that was providing clean water to the citizens of Hamilton. So the Gore Fountain was erected in 1859 to celebrate the fact that Hamilton had clean water. And it was also considered to be a real symbol of Hamilton's place, that it gave it some prestige along with the pump house. And over the years, of course, it's fallen apart, it's been repaired, and the connection that it has to cholera and the excitement over now we have a handle on cholera has been disconnected from it. So it's a very potent symbol from a period of time that has taken on new meaning now.
And I want to play you a clip of an interview we did with Dr. Karen Landman, infectious disease and public health specialist, on the reaction to the Ebola outbreaks in parts of West Africa.
During the Ebola epidemic in Africa, patients were turned away from healthcare centers, from birthing centers, from malaria treatment centers when they had symptoms of Ebola. Even if they didn't end up having Ebola, many of them were turned away and died because of the epidemic, even though they weren't actually infected with Ebola. And it's always hard to imagine what you would. It's hard to. We can imagine what we might do in a scenario, but then when the scenario actually hits, it may not actually match with our hypothetical reality.
Why do societies continue to grapple with the fear of infectious diseases?
A lot of it is the fear of the unknown. The fact that often these diseases are accompanied with horrible symptoms that are frightening in themselves. And one of the simplest ways of dealing with it is to run away and not come into contact with people who have the disease. It's a continual problem that we face, and that is the fear of the unknown and the fear of watching bodies experience misery and pain and to try to get away from it ourselves.
And the last question, what is your favorite epidemic?
Oh, well, as you know, I do enjoy studying epidemics because they're so rich. They teach us so much.
Yeah, we laugh about it because epidemics are not funny, right?
Favorite epidemic? Yeah. What is your favorite? Actually, I have been completely fascinated with the 1918 influenza pandemic for probably 2 decades now, because it has actually become the symbol of future pandemics. And often when we talk about pandemics today, the reference is in 1918, in 3 waves. This epidemic went around the world and is estimated to have killed perhaps 20 to 50 million people in 1 year. And we still don't have good numbers about it, but it captures so many things. It was associated with World War I. It was associated with all kinds of economic disparities. We find similar reactions of people being shunned and so on in 1918 because of influenza. So it's a fascinating moment in time when the world was transforming and becoming even more global than it is now.
What do you think, have we done a good job of controlling fear that surrounds epidemics?
No. In fact, that I think is the biggest problem about it, is that the fear reaction that people have, mostly because fear is often played up around epidemics. So if we take 1918, for example, and if we take about discussions Discussions about flu today. Often 1918 is cited, and the kinds of things that get cited are the high death toll, the fact that people in the ages of 20 to 40 were especially vulnerable to it. So all the scary stuff gets cited, and that tends to ramp up people's worries. What you don't hear being cited is that actually, 97 to 98% of the people who got that influenza, at least here in Canada, survived. So it's a matter of how we choose to talk about what is going on. So if we take Zika, for example, that we're hearing a lot about now, that's happening in South America.
The Zika virus?
The Zika virus, yes. We're hearing about, microcephaly, worries about mosquitoes and so on, which are all absolutely legitimate. But what we don't hear is that link between microcephaly and Zika is still poorly understood. So we tend to hear the worst without knowing what the alternative is, and that is we still need to know a whole lot more.
Anne Herring, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you
It's
for
been
inviting
fascinating.
me. I've enjoyed it.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.